All right, welcome back, everybody. I told you all that this would be the history and theory of public speaking that you'll get in lecture, and that when you go to lab, it's mostly going to be the practice of public speaking. We're going to start with a little bit of history and theory today, and this is history and theory that's going to drive a lot of the beginning parts of this class. I've tried to front load the semester where a lot of the heavy lifting is at the beginning of the semester. You have your first major speech due around midterms. The good news about that is you have a lot of time to prepare it. The bad news about that is between midterms and finals, you have 2 other speeches that you're going to have to give. So what I'm going to teach you today is how you're going to do your whole process from beginning to end when you sit down to write your speeches. There's a 5-part sequence that's pretty helpful that has been passed down for about 2,500 years. It originated a little bit in Aristotle's rhetoric. It's since been expanded by other people later on in the canon, like Cicero and Quintilian and Augustine. A lot of people have talked about the 5 canons of rhetoric as the beginning to end process for how you get to write and practice and polish and ultimately give your speeches. So we're going to spend a lot of time on the 5 canons. I'm going to give you a brief overview of all 5 of them today. You're then going to go to lab this week and next week and maybe a little bit the week after and do some practicing of the 5 canons. By the end of the semester, you should know these very well and you should be able to apply them. It's very hard to give any kind of speech unless you've gone through the whole process. It's also hard to do a lot of other activities, so this is one of those things that can serve you beyond the public speaking classroom in your everyday life. Now, when we're talking about canons, no matter how many times I say it's not this thing on the left, whenever I say the word canon, a lot of people picture the instrument of war, often associated with things like the Civil War, with people firing cannonballs at each other. That is not the kind of canon we're talking about in this class. That's a canon with 2 ends. When we're talking about a canon with 1 end, what we're really talking about is an idea or a set of ideas or maybe a set of texts that have been passed down from generation to generation. So in ancient Greece, when people were beginning to give speeches in political settings and when they were shifting from a primarily oral spoken culture to a more written culture, that's when we get a lot of our history and theory of public speaking. A lot of it's happening at the time that ancient Greece is shifting from an oral culture to a literate culture or a written culture. And what we see in the 5 canons are ideas for how to draft and polish a speech. A lot of people in that time were talking about speech making and speech writing as a way of engaging with the world around us, as a way of having a say in politics, as a way of having a little bit more influence. So when we're talking about a canon with 1 end, what we're talking about is a set of ideas that's been passed down. For those of you who are religious, you might be familiar with religious canons. A lot of religions will have sacred texts, whether that is the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, passed down from generation to generation. You can imagine that in ancient Greece, a lot of canons were passed down orally before they were written down. If you imagine a lot of the big works of literature, a lot of the big epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, those were passed down primarily in an oral culture before they were recorded. That's similar to what we're dealing with when we're talking about the 5 canons of rhetoric. For those of you who are not particularly religious, what you might think of is a literary canon. If you took an English class in high school prior to, say, the 1970s or 1980s, a lot of those classes would have famous works by famous people like Shakespeare, and it would be pretty weird to see something that's not normally on the list on the list. A lot of people since the 1980s, 1990s have been resisting that idea of a literary canon, that all high school classes should teach the same works of literature, but maybe that we want to expand our canon and look at literature beyond that. So when we're talking about the 5 canons of rhetoric, we're not talking about books, we're not talking about sacred texts per se that are passed down. We're talking more in terms of ideas. When we're talking about ideas within rhetoric, we have a 5-part process of everything that you need to know about how to write your speech. There's been a lot of adaptation, there's been a lot of expansion over the last 2,500 years, but these are the 5 general categories that you'll use to start when you sit down to write your speeches, how you're going to start your speech, how you're going to polish your speech, all of that. And I'm going to go over a brief overview, but one thing you should know is that these 5 canons usually happen in order, and they usually happen one step at a time. Where in a 21st century culture, we are very familiar with multitasking. A lot of you will try to do more than one of these canons at a time. I don't generally recommend that. But instead, what you'll probably want to do is take each one step at a time and make sure you give yourself enough time with each of them so that you don't get too far ahead of yourself or you don't rush the canons. Often when people try to do more than one at a time, they will actually end up not making their lives easier. They will make their lives harder because they're going to have to go back and do work that they should have done the first time around. So we're going to talk through the 5 canons. The first one that we have here is what we call invention. If you're not yet taking notes, you probably will want to take notes because these are going to be important for you for the course of the semester. Invention, very briefly, is generating ideas. You don't know yet what you're going to talk about. You don't know what your speech topic's going to be. If you know what your speech topic's going to be, maybe you don't know what the subtopics are, or maybe you know what the subtopics are, but you don't know what your thesis is yet. Invention also has to do with researching and finding good sources to support your ideas. A lot of you will want to give speeches on things that you care a lot about. One of my favorite things about teaching public speaking is getting to know my students as people, and oftentimes I get to know you through your speeches. I get to know the kinds of things that you find interesting. I get to know your politics a little bit. I get to know a lot of interesting things about you and your hobbies. Part of that is because of invention, and a lot of you will want to give speeches on things that you are personally interested in. One of the challenges for this class is to take those things that you're personally interested in and to be able to translate them to other people who may not be interested in those things. That's all going to take place at the level of invention. And when we do that, we want to make sure that it's not just our own ideas, but that we're backing up our ideas with other people's ideas as well. Yes, some of you might have some life experience, you might have some expertise that you can share, but you probably want to make sure that you have other people's voices included in conversation with yours, because otherwise your audience is likely to dismiss your ideas as a conflict of interest. So that's what we're talking about at the level of invention. Once we get past that idea phase, the next part is to figure out how those ideas all fit together, and that's the step called arrangement. Arrangement you might think of as organization. You've probably taken a lot of writing classes that have taught you how to write the 5-paragraph essay. They've taught you how to compose a thesis statement. They've taught you how to write transitions. They've taught you to have a good intro, body, and conclusion. Arrangement is how you take all of those ideas that are interesting to you and figure out how you get them in an order that will make sense to your audience. A lot of people are, like me, one draft writers. That is, you like to sit down. If you're writing a speech, you like to crank it all out in one draft, ideally within like a half hour or an hour, and you don't do much tweaking with it. I'm going to say that's a mistake. There's lots of good evidence from writing studies that say if you are a multi-draft writer, it usually means better writing. And the reason for that is because the order in which ideas come to us isn't always the order of ideas that makes the most sense to our audience. Our brains are kind of wired funny where we just jump from idea to idea to idea, and it's kind of like getting easily distracted, so you want to make sure you're taking some time to mess around with arrangement. Our third canon then, once we've done arrangement work, is style. Style is one of the canons that I think is the most fun and where you can show your personality. Style is all about language use and creative expression. It's about making the speech sound like you. It's about making the speech clear and specific. It's about making the speech resonate with your audience. You want it to sound good not just on paper, but when you read it out loud, you want it to sound good to the ear as well. So once you have your ideas, you've probably written them in some pretty general terms. They're not the most exciting ideas yet. This is where you get to play around with language. This is where you get to mess around with figures of speech and have some fun, and to make the speech unique and make it sound like you. These first 3 canons are what I like to refer to as the written canons. That is, this is the process of writing your speech. You're going to spend a lot of time writing drafts of your speech. I mentioned last week that we're going to have different kinds of outlines in this class. You'll see both of those outlines in action later next week when we meet. But when you're working through the first 3 canons, what you're hoping to get is a first full draft of your entire speech. You want to have the whole thing written from beginning to end. You want to have it clear. You want to have it arranged well. You want to have it polished. You want to make sure it sounds good. All of that is what you'll do before you even begin practicing your speech. Now, a lot of you are going to want to rush to get that first draft done. A lot of you are also going to put off that first draft as long as possible. Once you have that first full draft, you want to make sure that it's what you plan to say because you're going to do other things to get it ready for delivery day. And that's what's going to bring us to our 4th and 5th canons, or what I like to refer to as the oral canons. The 4th canon is what we call memory. And memory is all about figuring out how you're going to remember what to say and when you're going to say it and how you're going to say it. You'll notice that when I talk about memory, I will probably not use the word memorize. A lot of you will use the word memorize mistakenly when you are talking about memory. I do not want you to memorize your speeches for this class, and neither do your lab instructors. We're going to have different memory styles. There are lots of different ways that you can remember what's coming next. We're going to talk about those ways in a little bit of detail later today. We're going to go into more detail about those memory and delivery styles or memory and delivery strategies in a few weeks. But the important thing here is this is how you get your speech ready for speech day. Before you actually give your speech, you want to make sure that you've spent a lot of time practicing it. You want to practice it in a variety of different ways. You definitely want to practice it in ways that take you out of your comfort zone. A lot of us have really bad habits for when we get up to practice our speeches. We read it aloud to ourselves. We read it silently in our head to ourselves. We don't try new things, and it's very easy to develop bad habits when we're practicing. It's very hard to break those bad habits. So this is where I'm going to encourage you to get out of your comfort zone. Try some things that are a little bit goofy. Try some things that you don't normally do. The more fun you have during that fourth canon, the more you will relax on speech day, the more ready you will feel for your speech. The last canon then is what we refer to as delivery. Usually when I ask students what constitutes a good speech or what should be covered in a speech class, this is the canon that a lot of people think of. They think it's going to be an entire class developed solely around the canon of delivery. So they think we're going to spend all this time doing a whole bunch of elocution exercises where I have you stand, and when you change from one point to another, you gesture like this, and then you move over here, and then you move back, and then you give your conclusion. I'm not going to have you do that kind of work. But when we're talking about delivery, what we're talking about is how we use our voices and how we use our bodies on delivery day. Everything that we've done up until this point is building toward giving your actual speech, and there's a lot of things that you'll need to do to be ready on speech day. Some of those things are also going to have to do with making sure that you are taking good care of yourself when you get ready to give your speech. And so this is the 5-part process that we're going to use over and over and over again, whether it's for your major speeches or your mini speeches. You're going to want to know these 5 parts. You're going to want to know these terms. You're going to want to know the order in which they appear, because when you get up to give speeches later in life, this is the beginning to end template that the Greeks and others have passed down to you. It's the easiest, most efficient way to make sure that you're giving your speech. You also want to make sure that you give yourself enough time with each of these canons so that you're not rushing through some of them, because you're going to do some of them better than others. The goal is to do all 5 of these canons really well, and in order to do that, you have to give yourself lots of time to do them. I say often that this is a class in public speaking, but it's also a class in time management. So if you're a procrastinator, you're probably going to want to take some good notes. You're probably going to want to figure out how much time you need to give to each of these, because what I often see is students trying to get through all 5 of these canons in one night, the night before their speech. And when you do that, your classmates and your lab instructor can usually tell that your speech isn't as well prepared as it should be. So that's a warning that I'm going to give you in advance. Now, I've given you this brief overview. Let's go into a little bit more detail about what's expected in each canon and how you might do each canon well. So I mentioned the first canon was invention, and invention is usually the brainstorming phase. It's about figuring out new ideas. The metaphor I like to use is the light bulb going off in your head. You want to figure out what's your purpose, and from your purpose, you're probably going to want to figure out what your topic is. A lot of people struggle with invention. They struggle with topic selection. I had my lab this morning, and my lab students spent 5 minutes trying to generate as many topics as they possibly could. In 5 minutes, most of them were only able to come up with maybe a dozen or so. So you probably want to spend a lot of time thinking about invention, because there are a lot of topics that are pretty common. A lot of college students are interested in a lot of the same things. A lot of people who are born and raised in Minnesota and North Dakota are interested in a lot of the same things. You want to try and do something a little bit more unique. Your goal is to teach your audience something they don't already know, and if half of you really like hockey, a speech about hockey is probably not going to be all that interesting to people who already know a lot about it. A second part of invention is trying to figure out how much information do you include in your speech. Most of your speeches will have time limits. So for your major speeches, your first 2 speeches are about 5 minutes. For some of you, those 5 minutes will feel like an eternity, and they're going to go by really slowly, and you're going to figure out, how do I fill this time? I thought I had enough information. I don't have enough information. I got to keep adding stuff. For others of you, those 5 minutes are going to go by really quickly. I'm always a little surprised every semester when on the first speech, a lot of students go over time. So you have a 5-minute window, you have a minute on either side of that to stay within time limits. I'm always surprised when students go for 8, 9, 10, 12 minutes on that first speech. What I'm getting at here is you want to make sure that you practice your speech an awful lot. So we have the first 3 written canons, and those will help you figure out how much information to include. You want to make sure that you're practicing your speech with the full draft of your speech before you draft your speaking outline that you'll use on speech day. You want to practice that speech with a timer as many times as you possibly can. Practice it slow, practice it fast, practice it medium. And the average speaking rate is usually somewhere around 120 to 150 words per minute. Now, when I was in your shoes, we did an exercise where we tested how fast our speaking rate was. I was at about 180 words per minute, so I was on the faster end of it. I've consciously tried to slow my speech down, but what often happens for me is I get pretty excited about ideas, and so I talk pretty quickly. You want to make sure that you're prepared to have a little bit of leeway on either side. So if you take the lower end of that 120, multiply it by the lower limit, that gives you 480 words. If you multiply it by the upper limit, 150 times 6 minutes, that gives you about 900 words. So you probably want to have your speech somewhere around 750 words. That's pretty much the length of an op-ed. There's only so much you can say in that amount of time, but you want to make sure that you don't go over time. Now, if I were to demonstrate this to you, you see it how I see it from my perspective. If I'm teaching lecture and I have 300 of you come in at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and we're here for 50 minutes, and it's 20 below outside, and it's windy, and it might be snowing, and I talk for 7 minutes, a bunch of you are going to wonder why you bothered to come in at all. If I go 50 minutes and 1 second, all of you are shooting me daggers, you're packing up your bags, and I hear about it at the end of the semester on my teaching evaluations. So it's important that you stay within time limits because your audience has expectations about how much information you include in your speech. If you go way under that, they're probably going to think you're underprepared. If you go way over that, they're probably going to think that you're not really interested in them, and they're going to start tuning out. So I want to offer you a word of caution. I used to tell my students that at that 6-minute mark, when you go over the 1-minute window, I would stop grading your speech, and whatever you had given counted toward you. Whatever you hadn't given counted against you. So if you were in main point 2 of 3, you gave a speech with an intro and 2 main points, and you were supposed to give an intro with you're supposed to give a speech with an intro, 3 main points, and a conclusion. You're probably not getting the best grade. Another part of invention is figuring out what is the best available evidence. That evidence is going to change a little bit depending on your purpose. Your purpose might be informative, your purpose might be persuasive. Ideally, you want to teach your audience something they don't already know. So if you're giving an informative speech, you might have some things that you can personally contribute to that. But no matter what, as in an academic setting, you're also going to have to supplement that with other people's voices. This isn't just to fulfill some kind of arbitrary requirement from your professors that say you need 3 or 4 or 10 sources. What it's about is putting your ideas in conversation with other people's ideas to borrow a little bit from their ethos and to be able to express your ideas and say things that you didn't already know and most likely your audience didn't already know. So you're going to have to do some digging for that evidence. Another big part of invention is what we will call audience analysis later on in the semester. A lot of people who give speeches think about speeches from their perspective as the speaker. What do I need to do to prepare my speech? Ultimately, your goal in your speech is not about you. It's about your audience. It's about figuring out what I can teach them, how I can persuade them. So you're probably going to want to think about what they already know, what they might already believe, what kinds of arguments they might be susceptible to, what kinds of arguments they might resist. You're going to have to do a little bit of getting outside your own head. When I was an undergrad, I thought about going into psychology because I really liked learning how the human brain worked. Part of why I found communication instead is because it's more than one brain in conversation. Communication, by definition, requires at least 2 people, so it's my brain and it's your brain. The best definition I give of communication is usually interpersonal psychology. That is, what's happening in my brain is affecting what's happening in your brain. That's how I want you to think about giving your speeches. Another part of invention that maybe the Greeks didn't talk about quite as much is the idea of media. We live in a very mediated society in 21st century America. Almost all of you have laptops in front of you, or you spend time on social media. A lot of you have smartphones. A lot of you have speeches that are given to you, whether you realize they're speeches or not, in a variety of settings. If you watch YouTube or Snapchat videos, if you have interviews that you're going to give over Skype, there are technological ideas that you're going to have to keep in mind as well, and sometimes preparing your speech with that technology in mind is not easy. What I often say to my lab students is that Murphy's Law applies to technology or media more than just about any other aspect of public speaking. Your technology is likely to fail you. Murphy's Law means anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So you probably want to spend some time thinking about how you're going to incorporate that media into your presentation. You also want to practice with it so you don't make a fool of yourself when you are demonstrating. I had a presentation I gave as a graduate student. I had a clicker just like the one I'm using right now. And sometimes when I clicked advanced slide, it would go to the next slide, and sometimes it would go backwards, one or two. And it really messed with me because I wasn't used to it. So you want to make sure that you're prepared to deal with the technology. Probably one of the hardest parts of invention, however, is thinking about what doesn't belong in your speech. There's only so much you can cover in a 5-minute speech. If your speech has an intro and conclusion, that's probably going to knock off a minute or so. That leaves you with about 4 minutes to cover the other ideas you want to include. I'm going to encourage you to go for depth rather than breadth. What I mean by that is that it's better to cover 2 or 3 topics in detail than to cover 20 or 30 topics in 4 minutes and have maybe a sentence on each one. Your audience is going to have a hard time following it. You're going to have a hard time remembering what you're going to say next. So you probably want to cut down your ideas and figure out, maybe I can't say everything I want to say about this topic, but I can go into a little bit of detail about it. Now, in order to give a good speech, we also have to be mindful of how our conversation, or how our voice is in conversation with other people's voices. So some of you probably have some personal experience with your topics. Maybe you have a family member who has special needs and you want to talk about your family member in your speech. Maybe you have some work experience or some professional experience. Maybe you're from another country and you grew up in a war zone and you want your audience to understand that war. Sometimes we have personal expertise, and that can be really helpful in terms of framing our speech, in terms of getting our audience interested in our speech. Sometimes we also have expert knowledge of some kind. So sometimes we go to school. One of the things that qualifies me to teach lecture to you all is that I have not 1, not 2, but 3 degrees in communication. I spent about 10 years in school learning the language, learning the vocabulary, learning the history and theory of not just public speaking, but really a broad swath of communication. A lot of you probably have certain expertise from jobs that you've had. Maybe you have expertise from your major. Maybe you have expertise from skills that you've had to develop. Maybe you know how to do something really technical with auto mechanics, and you want to demonstrate that to your audience. Both of those things can be helpful, and both of those things belong in your speech, but you want to make sure that you're complementing your own voice with the voices of other people. So where you're going to do that is to look for published information. You're going to look for stuff that other people, other experts beyond yourself that you can include in your speech. Again, the goal is to teach your audience something that they don't already know. Oftentimes you will have more fun and you will give a better speech if you also learn some things along the way. But beyond that, you want to make sure that it's not just your perspective, because if it's just you, or if it's just you and your friends and family, those people are too close to you, and your audience isn't going to be sure that they're getting a good objective view of the situation, and they're probably going to dismiss you and say, what qualifies this person to talk to me about this topic? I want to hear from some experts as well. So as you're doing that, I want to make sure that you supplement your own voice with the voices of others. One of the best places on campus to do that is this building that I have up on the left here. Raise your hand if you know what this building is. Somebody go ahead and shout out, what is this building? Good, the Chester Fritz Library. The Chester Fritz Library is one of the best places on campus for you to find that published information. A lot of people will, if they have a topic and they know they have a minimum number of sources, will go to Google, they'll type in their topic into Google, they'll find 3 results, they'll say 1, 2, 3, I've got my sources for my speech, they're done. When I was in grad school, one of my professors used to talk about what he called satisficing. Satisficing is a combination of satisfying the needs of an assignment and making sacrifices because you're strapped for time or you're strapped for intellectual or emotional energy. You just don't want to invest that much time looking for sources. If you're going to go to Google, that's about the same as going to Wikipedia. It's not really all that helpful, and it's stuff that most people in this room either already know or could easily find out if they find the top 3 sources. So I'm going to encourage you as much as possible to make use of the library, and there's a couple good reasons for that. If you make it through 4 or more years here at UND and you never once set foot in the library, or at least use the resources available through the library, like our databases and our journals, I'm going to consider that a personal failure on my part. I'm going to also consider that a personal failure on your part. The reason for that is because there's a lot of information through the library, whether that's in books or whether that's in scholarly journals, that you have access to right now as students who are paying tuition here at UND. And the second you graduate, you're going to lose access to all of that information. The information that we have in the library is some of the best information available because it's published by people who are current experts in the field. These are people who are professors at other universities. These are people who work for nonprofit organizations, who are trying to get the most recent, the best quality information that they can possibly find, and they're going to put that information into repositories that are peer-reviewed. That means that it's not just Joe Schmo professor at Minnesota or Wisconsin, but it's Joe Schmo professor at Minnesota or Wisconsin who submits to a journal or writes a book that 2 other people review, and they are also experts in the field, and they say, yep, this is good, or no, it's not. A lot of good quality academic journals, a lot of peer-reviewed journals have rejection rates around 90%. That means that professors are writing things, and 90% of the stuff that they write, the reviewers are going to say, nope, not good enough, try again. So they're looking for the best available information they can find, and they're trying to put that information into places where other academics like you and me can access that information. So one thing to be mindful of is you're paying tuition dollars to make use of that knowledge, and you're going to lose access to it as soon as you graduate. So make sure you use it while you're here. Another reason why I say that it's a personal failure on your part and my part if you don't use the library is because I'm friends with quite a few librarians. They are some of the smartest, friendliest, most knowledgeable people around. I have several librarian friends who have told me the same story where a student has come to them and said, I'm looking for this book. It's got a red cover, and that's the only information the student has, and the librarian knows which questions to ask to figure out what kind of book is it, and to find the exact title of the book, and to find where in the library it is. I'm telling you, librarians are some of the most useful people, the most friendly people around. You want to make sure that you ask them for help if you need help finding stuff for your topics. Another really neat feature about the library is that every single major at the university has a subject database with peer-reviewed journals in it, and they usually have their own major-specific librarian as well, or at least college-specific librarian. So you want to make friends with those people. You want to have them help you find stuff for your topic if you're not sure where it is. There are a couple other places that you can look. One of them is one that you're probably a little bit familiar with, and that is something called Google Scholar. If you're going to put your topic into Google Scholar, it filters out some of the stuff that's not peer-reviewed, and it looks for some of that academic stuff, some of that peer-reviewed academic journal or book stuff that might be useful for your topic. If you go into Google Scholar, you might find a bunch of articles and a bunch of books that look really useful for your speech. There's going to be a little bit of a problem when you try to access it through Google Scholar, though. Has anybody encountered this? What do you think might be the problem trying to get sources off of Google Scholar? Maybe you haven't used it. That's all right. If you're going to find an article on Google Scholar, what's often going to happen is that that article is going to be behind a paywall. You're going to get an article that you may or may not use in your speech. It looks interesting based on the title and based on the abstract. Google Scholar is going to tell you you have to pay $40 or $60 to read that article. Most of the time, those articles are the same articles that we have access to through the library. So if you find it on Google Scholar, find it in our library as well. And if we can't find the exact article that you're looking for, they can probably find a similar one. Some of you are also not going to give speeches that are based in your majors per se or based in academic knowledge, but are going to be more based in current events. So you might be looking through newspapers, you might be looking through magazines and blogs and other media coverage. You have access to a lot of those things by way of Google, but you also have access to those by way of the library. We have a database here called ProQuest, and ProQuest can aggregate a whole bunch of newspaper articles on the same topic. So I'm doing an essay that I'm writing right now on the Parkland shooting, and just this morning I found 315 articles from newspapers all over the country about the Parkland shooting that I plan to read. And it's able to aggregate them so I don't have to click on each individual website, but I can print out all 315 articles or however many there were and read them. So if you're looking for stuff in current events, you also have good access to that through the library. A lot of databases will also have field-specific resources as well. So the one for communication studies is called ComIndex Online, and it has access to the top journals in communication. If you're a biology major, if you're an aviation major, a nursing major, an engineering major, you're going to have specific databases that are unique to your major as well, and you can search specifically within those databases. Ultimately, what you're looking for are facts, statistics, examples, testimony, reports, documents, anything that you can find that will be useful to teach your audience something that they don't already know, and to be able to say it in a way that fits in with other stuff that you're talking about. It's relevant, it's connected, it helps build your case, whether that case is informative or persuasive. So invention is going to be an important canon. You're going to spend a lot of time on invention. It's probably the hardest canon for a lot of students. Nevertheless, it's a good one and one that you'll want to make sure you know how to do well. Once you get past the invention stage, you're going to then try and figure out, how do I put all these ideas together? I've got 20 different ideas. I have to figure out how they're all going to fit together in a 5-minute speech. A lot of people are naturally inclined to be more like the picture on the top here or more like the picture on the bottom here. If you ask me, I like to pride myself on saying that I'm more like the type on the top. If you happen to walk into my office, or if you ask my wife, they will tell you that I'm sometimes more like the bottom. Nevertheless, a lot of you probably have one style or the other that you prefer. If you are the type who identifies more with the picture on the bottom, you're probably going to want to do some arrangement work, and not just in your personal life, but in your speeches as well. A lot of people just kind of throw ideas together in the order that comes to them. You want to make sure that you're throwing them together in a way that makes sense and in a way that flows well. So you're probably going to want to write more than one draft of your speech. You're probably going to want to spend a lot of time revising the arrangement of that speech. One thing to consider is, what order do you want to put your main points in? You probably have ideas come to you 1, 2, 3, but the most logical way to put it is 2, 3, 1. You won't be able to figure that out until you read your speech several times. Sometimes it's going to help to read your speech beginning to end. Sometimes it's going to help you arrange your speech to read it out of order. One of my favorite exercises is to have students read their speech backwards. Start with the conclusion, work your way back to the intro. Another favorite of mine is to do a little bit of physical violence to your speech once you've written it, and to cut it up. That is, print it out, cut it up sentence by sentence, and sit on your living room floor and rearrange it. You'll be surprised how often you'll make connections that you didn't see that will lead to a more logical flow and a more logical organization. You want to figure out how much detail you want to give to each main point. A lot of speeches are what I call off balance. That is, if there are 3 main points in a 5-minute speech, what will happen is your introduction will be 2 minutes, your first main point will be about 2.5 minutes, and then main point 3, main point 4, and conclusion all happen in like 45 seconds. And it feels really rushed, it feels a little bit off. Your audience is going to wonder why you even bothered to talk about main points 2 and 3 and your conclusion if you're only going to talk about each of them for like 10 or 15 seconds. So you want to make sure that you're giving the same amount of time and the same amount of energy to each of your main points. Another thing to consider as you're thinking about audience analysis is, what does my audience already know, and what do they need to know? A lot of times this will happen in your second speech. Your techne speech is going to be focused on your major or on your career. There's a lot of terms, there's a lot of ideas from your major that you probably already know and other people in your field probably know. One of the hard parts of giving a speech outside of your major is to be able to translate those ideas in ways that are still intellectually rigorous, but nevertheless make sense to people who are not in your field. You're going to have to do some translation work. So do I need to provide any historical context? Do I need to define particular terms? How will I know how much time, how much specificity and detail do I need to do for each of those? You also want to think about transitions. This is one of the more overlooked parts of a speech. I can't tell you how many speeches I've seen that the only transition students know how to do is, now that I've talked about A, let's talk about B. Now that I've talked about B, let's talk about C. Now that I've talked about C, let's talk about D. And by the third one, you're like, okay, you can come up with another way to say that. So you probably want to think about what transition words that you might use. One of my favorite handouts on writing is from the University of Minnesota Writing Center. They have a handout on sentence transitions that has not only the logical relationship between ideas, but words and phrases that you can use in English to express those ideas. They're words that we don't see all that often when we have everyday interpersonal conversation, but are usually expected when we're giving formal public speeches. The final consideration you have for arrangement is introductions and conclusions. That's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about next week. A lot of speakers really hate writing and giving introductions and conclusions. We're going to talk about some strategies for how to do that, but those are really important. If you don't have a solid intro and conclusion, your audience is probably not going to be very into your speech. They're probably not going to care about it. And if they do, they're probably not going to remember it very well. These are generally pretty expected, especially in Western audiences in the United States and Europe. It's very common to have a speech with an intro, body, and conclusion. You want to make sure you know how to do it well. That'll take us to our third canon then, and our third canon is once you've got the ideas and you've arranged them, you're going to figure out how to get them to sound good. That's our canon of style. When I'm talking about style, I'm not talking about different art movements. I'm not talking about style and fashion and makeup and things like that. I'm not talking about dance or Gangnam Style. What I'm probably more talking about is like Strunk & White's elements of style. That is, we're talking about language use, and we're talking about how to use proper grammar, proper syntax, but also creative expression. We want to make sure that our speeches are not boring and dry and that they don't sound like they're written by a third grader. We want to make sure that they reflect our personality. We want to make sure that they make us look professional, and that they're clever in ways that will resonate with ourselves and our audience. So the main consideration with style is what language do you want to use to express your ideas? How formal do you want to be with that? How informal do you want to be? There are some settings that call for you to be a little bit more formal. Those are ones that you might have to dress up for, maybe an awards ceremony or a job interview. Those are the kinds of things that you'll probably want to have maybe some advanced knowledge and some advanced language or jargon with. So you want to consider how formal you want to be with that. Sometimes you also want to consider things like civility and decorum. In high school classes, you were probably told that there are certain things you're not allowed to talk about. Certain topics might have been banned. Certain language, like swearing or difficult topics like sexuality, might not be things that you would want to talk about, or racism. You want to figure out if it's okay in the setting that you have to uphold certain standards of decorum, or more obviously, to violate them. You want to see if there are times where it's okay to swear for dramatic effect, if it's okay to challenge your audience to make them uncomfortable. Those are some things that are not always easy. One of the biggest ways that style goes wrong this way is with humor. There's a fine line between being funny and being offensive, and a lot of people will cross that line, and once you do, it's hard to come back from. So you want to be careful with that. Another consideration with language and style is how specific do I need to be? Am I talking just generally about peace and freedom and justice, or am I talking about those things in particular places or in particular ways that are more or less clear? You want to make sure that as much as possible, you want to be concrete, you want to be clear, you want to be specific with your language. The more creative you can be, the more precise you can be, the more that language is likely to resonate. The last consideration we have for style is what we call figures of speech. Figures of speech are less common in formal academic writing. They're much more common in public speaking. These are little language tricks and strategies that you can use to get your audience to think about a concept in a new way. They're clever ways to use sentence structure, clever ways to use language that resonate with different people. One of the more familiar ones that you might know is JFK in his inaugural address saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That's a figure of speech known as anti-metaboly. It takes this idea and inverts it. And when you think about it, it changes the relationship. There are lots of different figures of speech, anaphora, polysyndeton. There's a whole bunch of these that you can know. I don't expect you to know all of them, but there are a lot of them that you can use, and you can have some fun with them and be a little bit more clever and creative and a little bit more memorable through your language choices. Once we've gotten through the written canons, that's where we will get into the fourth canon of memory. And I'll tell you that I intentionally have you all do recordings of yourself. You're going to be doing peer and self-evaluations. And a lot of students resent me for making you all do self-evaluations. Your self-evaluation is going to be a recorded video of your speech. A lot of people don't like hearing themselves talk. They don't like seeing themselves on video. That is one of the single best exercises that you can do to become a better speaker, because A, there are going to be things that you didn't know that you were doing that you're going to be surprised by, and a lot of those things are going to be things that you're doing well. You're going to think that your speech didn't go so well. You're going to say, it actually doesn't look so bad on video. From the audience's perspective, it wasn't so bad. The other reason why I like having you do peer or self-evaluations is because it actually helps you build up your confidence. Last week we talked about communication apprehension. Doing self-evaluations is one of those good ways to say, actually, I'm pretty good at giving speeches. There are some things that I need to work on, but I can do them well. When I have students do self-evaluations on their speeches, the single most common comment that I get from students is that they wish they had given more time for the fourth canon of memory. That fourth canon is the rehearsal time. In order to get to it, you have to have a full polished draft of your speech pretty early on. A lot of you will want to have at least a week or so to practice your speech before you have to give it. That means that you have to have the polished draft where you've gotten through the first 3 canons well in advance of a week before the deadline. So memory is how we remember what we're going to say and the order in which we're going to say it. Now, when we're talking about memory, the first consideration is that there are lots of different ways to do the canon of memory. I said that I was going to try very carefully to avoid the idea of memorizing your speeches. That is, I don't want you to write out your whole speech and spend hours and hours and hours trying to remember every single word in the right order. It doesn't usually work very well. There are 4 primary strategies for memory, and you'll see I've included a figure of speech and mnemonic device known as an acrostic to help you remember them. One of those is to give a manuscript speech. That is, if you were going to go through the first canons and to skip the fourth canon entirely and go straight into delivery, you would read your speech out loud, word for word, to the class. Now, some of you might have Dr. Queen as your lab instructor. Dr. Queen has one of the best ways of talking about this that I love. She says this is a public speaking class, not a public reading class. I think that's really important for you all to consider. A lot of people, if they're nervous or if they're new at public speaking, think this is the best way to give speeches. I'm going to write out everything word for word, and I'm going to read it to my audience. Unfortunately, what often happens in that setting, no matter how many times you've practiced it, is your delivery will fall flat in a number of ways. For starters, if you're reading something word for word, your eyes and your posture are going to float toward the text, and you're going to look really awkward. You're not going to have good posture. You're not going to have good eye contact. Additionally, you're probably not going to be able to engage your audience. You're probably not going to be able to scan the room. You're probably not going to gesture. You're probably going to have a very monotone voice. This is my speech. I am a robot. I am not very engaging, and I have not spent much time practicing it. So that's one possibility, and there are ways to do manuscript speaking well, but that's not what this class is about. The second one is what we call impromptu speaking. Impromptu speaking is when you're given a prompt, and it's usually a short prompt, and you're expected to come up with an answer on the spot. You don't get a whole lot of time to think about it. You don't get a whole lot of time to prepare. Impromptu speaking has some benefits as well, and one of them is that most likely, if you're given a prompt, you're going to answer with something that is pretty authentically you. It's not going to sound scripted. It's not going to sound overly rehearsed. It's going to sound like it's coming from the heart. One of the drawbacks of impromptu speaking is that it often is hard to do. A lot of people don't know what to say when they're given a prompt and they don't get time to think about it, and they freeze up and they look like deer in the headlights. Impromptu speaking works really well for short speeches. You might be able to get away with maybe 30 or 45 seconds of an impromptu speech. But if you're giving a 5-minute speech and you're expected to have sources and transitions and all of that in there, you don't want to give that speech impromptu because you're going to forget a whole bunch of stuff that you need to include, and you might have no idea what you're going to say next, and your audience will know that as well. The third type is memorized speaking, and like I said, I don't want or expect you to memorize your speeches for this class. There are some benefits to that as well, and one of them is that you don't need to rely on any notes, and you can just speak, and you've probably practiced it enough times that you can feel really good about it. It has some of the same benefits as a manuscript speech where you have all of the words you need to say. You just need to know the order in which to say them, and you need to remember all of it. You can probably memorize a short poem. You can probably memorize maybe a Shakespearean sonnet. A lot of you probably did exercises like that in high school. Again, if you're trying to memorize a 5 or 10 or 50-minute long speech, that's probably going to be pretty hard for a lot of you. What we're going to focus on in this class is what we call extemporaneous speaking, and this is what we're going to spend some time talking about over the next few weeks. This is the mode of public speaking that I want you to engage in for this class. This is what's going to be expected of you. This is what you're going to be graded on. Extemporaneous speaking is a little bit of a combination of the other 3 types. It picks up on a lot of the pros of the other 3 types without dealing with most of the cons of it. What extemporaneous speaking is going to look like is you're going to have a preparation outline. That's going to be the full text of your speech, intro, body, conclusion, transition, citations, all of the above, written out, and you're going to practice with that. That's called a preparation outline. You're then going to take that preparation outline and cut it down into a speaking outline. A speaking outline takes that preparation outline and goes sentence by sentence and cuts it down to key words. So you will still have all of the ideas that you need to give in your speech, and you'll have a pretty good sense of the order of those ideas, but you won't be glued to your notes. You won't have to memorize anything. You have a little bit of freedom. If you want to ad-lib and go into impromptu mode and say something that's not in your notes, it's easier to do that. So we're going to get really familiar with that process. The important thing is that you understand the differences between those two outlines, which we'll go into detail over the next few weeks about. And you want to make sure that you get sufficient practice with each of them. A lot of people try to rush to the speaking outline, and they skip over the preparation outline, and usually they haven't fully thought through their ideas, and that's where they get stuck. So you're going to want to make sure you do both of those, and if the word outline scares you, hopefully when you see some examples of it, and you see the benefits that it has for you, it'll feel less scary and it'll feel more important. Ultimately, what we're after with memory is how am I going to remember where I am in my speech? How am I going to remember the order of ideas? If I get stuck, how will I know what's coming next? I've got a video that I'm going to show you in 2 weeks that's going to have some strategies to help you with that. Some of those are going to probably be a little bit surprising to you, but hopefully they'll be useful. Another thing we want to think about with memory is how do I make my speech memorable? For the most part, you want to make your speech memorable for your audience. You want them to remember your speech a week, a month, 5 years, 10 years after you give your speech. I'll tell you, if you think that that sounds impossible, there's a particular speech that I can remember from when I taught in Texas about 7 or 8 years ago. I had a student who was giving a speech about how to do CPR, and the reason I remember this speech is because the student had a clever detail in there. What they said was, as you're doing chest compressions for CPR, the rhythm of your chest compressions is the same as the rhythm of the song Staying Alive. I don't know if that's accurate. I think it is. But my student used that in their speech, and I still remember that speech even though it was like 7 years ago. Those are the kinds of details you want to be looking for as you engage in invention. Those are also the kinds of details that will help you remember what you want to say, because you're going to be excited to share that clever thing that you found or that clever style that you wrote. So you want to make it memorable for your audience. You also want to make it memorable for yourself. Last but not least, with memory, you want to think about how much you need to practice your speech. For some of you, it's going to be 5 or 6 times will be enough. For some of you, it'll be hundreds of times, and it still won't be enough. There's no way of knowing in advance, but the best advice I have for you is to practice as many times until it feels comfortable. You probably then want to practice even more than that. You want to practice in ways that get you out of your comfort zone. The best way to do well in this class, the best way to do well beyond this class, is to practice your speech many, many times. Practice it in many different ways as well. Have some fun when you're giving your speech. I have a whole list of exercises, and a lot of them are goofy, that I have my students do, that take them out of their comfort zone. The more fun you have in that rehearsal process, the easier your delivery will be once you get to that. And that's where we are now, and that's ultimately what we're building toward, is the 5th canon of delivery. Delivery is ultimately about how you're going to prepare yourself for speech day. How am I going to get my speech ready? Hopefully I'm not writing it the night before, but I started writing it now. Your first speech might be due, say, at the end of February. You probably want to get a head start on your research. But some of that is also about self-care practices that you have when you get ready for speech day. I think last week I told a horror story about my student who passed out in the hallway because she was up all night writing the speech the night before and ended up not taking care of herself, drank too much coffee. She passed out, she hit her head. So you want to make sure you're engaging in good practices on speech day. You also want to think about where and when and how you're going to present your speech. If it's really hot in the room, maybe you have to prepare for that. If it's early in the morning, maybe you have to prepare for that. How are you going to control your verbal expressions? How are you going to control your pitch, your speaking rate, your breathing? How are you going to control your nonverbal expressions? Delivery is all about control over your speech and body. For those of you who are in theater, for those of you who play sports, you probably know that it's pretty easy to develop a lot of bad habits. It's really hard to break those bad habits. And so you want to practice in ways that are not just what you always do, but actually consciously thinking about things like your gestures or your movements or your facial expressions. Ultimately, what you want in your delivery is to appear knowledgeable and confident. And you're going to get there by practicing in a variety of different ways and by giving yourself enough time to work through all of the things I've given you here. Now, I've given you the 5 canons as a process, and it is the beginning-to-end version of how you're going to give your speech. You'll notice here on this slide, I've given it backwards. The reason for that is because working through the canons is not just about all of the steps, but it can also be about figuring out time management. You want to make sure that you're doing these canons one step at a time. If you're going to work backwards, it can help you figure out how much time you need for each step. So if you know that you need at least a week to practice your speech, you want to have that preparation outline done at least a week in advance. That means getting through the first 3 canons pretty early. You want to make sure that you give yourself enough time with each of the canons so that you're not rushing through all of them, because you want to make sure you do them well. The last thing I have for you then is understanding how the canons can help you capitalize on the strengths that you already have and continue to develop the ones that are not so easy for you. Most of us will gravitate naturally toward maybe 2 or 3 of these canons, and we're pretty confident in those. When we're most nervous, draw upon the canons that you already know how to do well. When you are trying to develop your skills, think about the canons that are not so easy to you. You have about 35 people in your lab section. There's going to be different distributions in terms of strengths and weaknesses. If you're trying to develop your skills, try and look for people who do the canons that you don't do so well. Maybe you ask them for advice. Maybe you focus a little bit more on those chapters of the textbook or those lecture and lab lessons. In any case, ultimately what we're trying to do is recognize that we all have things that we do well with public speaking. We all have things that we can work on. So you're going to want to know these canons well, and you're going to want to work on the ones that are more challenging for you. So I'll leave you there, and I'll see you all next week.